Today we're going to take a look at my portfolio holdings that are reporting Q1 earnings for week 18, covering April 28th through May the 2nd, 2025. The earnings calendar shows Entergy, UPS, Altria, Ares Capital, and Pfizer are reporting before the market opens on April 29th, while Carey reports after the market close. For April the 30th, Hess Midstream shares results before the bell, and Microsoft, Prudential, and VICI Properties report after the bell. On May 1st, Hershey, NNN REIT, Medical Properties Trust share results before the market open, followed by two large-cap tech companies, Amazon and Apple, reporting after the bell. Finally, on Friday, May 2nd, Chevron reports before the market opens. For each company, we'll examine the revenue and earnings estimates and the options market implied move. We'll review the current price charts, looking at relative strength and momentum indicators. I'll be interested to read your comments for each of these companies as we await their earnings report. I would also like to know if you hold any of these companies in your stock portfolio. Let's get started. We'll get started by looking at my earnings worksheet that I use to track all the earnings for these companies. We can see that Johnson & Johnson and U.S. Bank reported during week 16. They both beat on their earnings and revenue, and they both moved within their expected move of 4.14 and 7.03. They were initially down after the earnings, but 1 week later, they were both up. Then if we take a look at the companies that reported last week, RTX beat on top and bottom lines. They had an initial move of minus 9.81% with an implied move of 4.84. Tesla missed on both the top and bottom lines. They had an implied move of 10.77, and they were actually up immediately after earnings to close at 5.37. Agree Realty beat on the top and bottom lines. They were down minus 2.4%. T beat on the revenue, missed on earnings by a penny. Their implied move was 5.27, and their initial move was actually up 0.85. AbbVie beat on both the top and the bottom lines. They were up 3.15 after earnings with an implied expected move of 4.82. And then Centene beat on the top and bottom lines. They had an implied move of 6.9%, and they were actually down 6.32%. Then if we look and focus on the companies that will be reporting this week, we can see that we can see the revenue for each company. We can see the estimated earnings per share, and then the expected or implied move based on the options market. So ETR has an expected move of 367. UPS has an expected move of 7.10. Altria is 3.80. Ares Capital is 5.32. Pfizer is 3.96. Carey is 7 even. Hess Midstream is 6.18%. Microsoft is 4.87%. Prudential Financial is 6.9%. VICI Properties 4.03%. Hershey is 5.06%. NNN REIT is 8.62%. MPW, Medical Properties Trust, is 6.73%. Amazon expected move is 6.75%. Apple 5.81%. And finally Chevron at 3.99%. Before we take a look at the individual company earnings previews and their relative strength in the market, I want to get a basic overview of where we sit with the current market conditions. So one thing that we'll notice, we did close the SPX at over 5,500, which is a pretty interesting point, where we saw on March the 13th, the market closed at about that level. It improved slightly while we were awaiting the tariff announcements. It came down to test that level again. Then the announcements were made on April the 2nd after the market close. The tariffs were much more onerous than the market was expecting, and we had a pretty drastic market sell-off. And now we've come back up to test that 5,500 level as resistance. We are seeing improved relative strength, and we're above the midpoint. The PPO is trading in the negative area, but it is improving. And then one of the interesting things that I see here is we have a lot of buyers in this particular price bands, and we also have the 50-day moving average coming into play. So I think we're going to see some resistance as we start moving up into this area, and we'll probably come back down to trade sideways for a while these tariffs are being negotiated and finalized before the market can really stabilize. So we are trading in a pretty volatile market. If we take a look at the VIX, we can see that it is improving. It's coming down from this peak near 60, and it's drifting downward. We're currently sitting at about 24. We'd like to see it below 20 before the market really stabilizes. So that's a general market overview of what we're looking at before we move into the earnings preview for the various companies. In the previous quarter, Entergy reported revenues of $2.74 billion, missing estimates by $502.24 million, and they reported normalized EPS actuals of 66 cents per share, beating by 3 cents. For this quarter, we're expecting $305 billion and earnings per share of 69 cents per share. Over the last 90 days, 5 analysts have raised their estimates, and 1 analyst has lowered their estimates. On the price chart, ETR is showing positive price momentum, and the PPO and RSI are both above the midline, with the PPO above the signal line. In the previous quarter, UPS reported revenue of $25.3 billion, missing by $114.12 million. They reported earnings of $2.75 per share, beating by 22 cents. For this quarter, they're estimating $21.02 billion with $1.38 in earnings. Over the last 90 days, no analysts have raised estimates and 14 analysts lowered estimates. When we look at the UPS price chart, we can see that it's basically trading sideways. We can see that the PPO and RSI are both in negative territory, not yet crossing the midline point. So UPS is showing negative relative strength going into earnings. For Altria Group, in the previous quarter, they reported revenue of $5.11 billion, beating estimates by $59.68 million. They reported earnings per share of $1.29, beating by 1 penny. For this quarter, they're expecting $4.62 billion in revenue and $1.19 per share in earnings. Over the last 90 days, no analysts have raised estimates and 6 analysts have lowered estimates. Moving into earnings, we can see that the price chart is showing positive price action. We can also see that the PPO and the RSI are trading above the midline and showing relative strength. For Ares Capital, in the previous quarter, they reported revenue of $750 million. They missed by $28.5 million. They reported 55 cents per share in earnings, missing by 3 cents. For this quarter, they're expected to report $769.95 million, and their earnings per share is estimated to be 54 cents. Over the last 90 days, no analysts have raised estimates and 8 analysts lowered estimates. For the Ares price chart, we can see that they are showing positive price action. But if we look at the PPO, we can see it's in negative territory, although it has crossed above the signal line. We can also see that the relative strength is above the midpoint, sitting at 52.19. So it is showing positive relative strength. Pfizer reported $17.76 billion in the previous quarter, beating by $499.25 million. They reported 63 cents of earnings per share, beating by 17. For this quarter, they're expecting revenue of $14.11 billion with earnings per share of 69 cents. Over the last 90 days, 1 analyst has raised estimates and 2 analysts have lowered estimates. When looking at the Pfizer chart, we can see that they do have positive price action. However, their PPO is in negative territory, although they have crossed the signal line. We can also see that the RSI is below the midpoint at 44.43. So overall, I would say they are showing positive momentum going into earnings. For WPC, in the previous quarter, they reported $406.17 million in revenue, beating by $1.89 million. They reported funds from operations of 85 cents per share, missing by 34 cents. For this quarter, they're expecting $414.68 million in revenue and $1.20 per share in funds from operations. Over the last 90 days, no analysts have raised estimates and 1 analyst lowered estimates. For the WPC chart, we could see that it did have positive price action, but it since has rolled over and is coming back down. If we look at the PPO and the RSI, we can see that they're trading pretty much at the midpoint. The RSI is sitting at 50.48, which I would grade this as pretty neutral going into the earnings. For Hess Midstream, they reported revenue in the previous quarter of $395.9 million, beating by $5.03 million. They reported EPS normalized at 68 cents per share, which was in line with estimates. For this quarter, they're expected to report $381.62 million with earnings per share of 69 cents. Over the last 90 days, no analysts have raised estimates and 5 analysts have lowered estimates. The Hess Midstream chart is showing positive price action. But when we look at the PPO and the RSI, we can see that the PPO is negative, but it did cross the signal line, and the RSI is sitting right at the midpoint. So it shows somewhat neutral relative strength going into the earnings. Microsoft in the previous quarter reported revenue of $69.63 billion, beating estimates by $823.09 million. They reported earnings per share of $3.23, beating estimates by 11 cents. For this quarter, they're expected to produce $68.43 billion in revenue with earnings per share of $3.22. Over the last 90 days, 19 analysts have raised estimates and 11 analysts have lowered estimates. Microsoft has shown somewhat sideways trading price action over the last couple of weeks. The PPO and the RSI are showing improvement. The PPO crossed above the signal line but still in negative territory, and the RSI is sitting above the midpoint at 55.97. So I would say that they are showing positive relative strength going into earnings. Prudential in the previous quarter reported $13.01 billion in revenue, $2.96 per share normalized, missing by 30 cents. For this quarter, Prudential is expected to deliver $14.56 billion in revenue and $3.18 for EPS. Over the last 90 days, no analysts have raised estimates and 11 analysts have lowered estimates. The Prudential chart is showing some upward price movement. PPO is negative but has crossed over the signal line, and the RSI is sitting at 48.59 below the midpoint. So this is somewhat neutral momentum moving into the earnings. In the previous quarter, VICI Properties reported $976.05 million, beating by $6.76 million, and the FFO was reported at 58 cents per share, missing by 9 cents. For this quarter, VICI is expected to report $977.03 million in revenue, and funds from operations is expected to be 68 cents per share. For the last 90 days, 2 analysts have raised estimates and 0 analysts have lowered estimates. For the VICI chart, we are seeing some improved price action, but it is starting to roll over and come back down. When we look at the PPO and the RSI, we can see that the PPO is in positive territory with the momentum crossing above the signal line about 7 or so trading days ago. The RSI is beginning to roll over, but it is above the midpoint, currently sitting at 53.93. And this downward action in the prices over the last 3 days might be simply a rotation from less risky assets to more risk-on assets that we've seen over the last few days. In the previous quarter, Hershey reported revenue of $2.89 billion, beating by $45 million, and reported earnings per share of $2.69, beating the estimates by 31 cents. In the current quarter, Hershey is expected to report revenue of $2.79 billion, with earnings per share of $1.93. In the previous 90 days, there have been 2 upward revisions and 11 downward revisions. For the Hershey's price chart, we've basically been trading sideways for the last month or so. We can see that the PPO is under the midpoint and basically trading sideways. And the RSI is currently sitting below the midpoint at 44.53. So it looks like pretty neutral action moving into earnings. In the previous quarter, NNN reported operational income of $218.48 million, with funds from operations of 82 cents per share that were in line with estimates. For this quarter, they're expected to report $219.68 million, with 82 cents FFO per share. Over the last 90 days, no analysts have raised estimates and 3 analysts have lowered estimates. On the NNN price chart, we can see we've had some upward price action, but it has rolled over and beginning to decrease just a bit. If we look at the PPO and the RSI, we can see that the PPO is in negative territory below the midpoint. We do have a signal line crossover, and the RSI is trading just below the midpoint at 48.66, and it's been trading pretty much sideways as far as relative strength. So it looks like neutral momentum as we move into the earnings. In the previous quarter, Medical Properties Trust reported revenue of $231.84 million, beating estimates by $13.08 million. They reported funds from operations of 18 cents per share, beating the estimates by 2 pennies. For this quarter, the revenue estimate is $234.63 million, and the funds from operations is expected to be 14 cents per share. Over the last 90 days, we've not seen any analysts revise estimates up or down. When we look at the MPW price action, we can see some upward movement in the price. When we look at the PPO and the RSI, we see that it's operating below the midline. We look to be crossing over maybe the signal line within the next day or so, and the RSI is below the midline at 48.59, so it looks somewhat neutral moving into the earnings. Amazon in the previous quarter reported $187.79 billion in revenue, beating estimates by $563.26 million. They reported earnings of $1.86 per share, beating estimates by 38 cents. For this quarter, They are expected to report revenue of $155.08 billion and earnings per share of $1.36 per share. Over the last 90 days, 8 analysts have raised estimates and 22 have lowered estimates. Looking at the Amazon price chart, we've really seen some choppy price action. We've seen up and down and up again as the market tries to figure out what kind of impacts there will be on Amazon related to the tariffs. If we look at the PPO and the RSI, we can see the PPO operating below the midpoint, but we do have a crossover, which would indicate a buy. That also seems to be confirmed by an RSI that's above the midpoint at 52.14, which is a positive relative strength moving into the earnings. In the previous quarter, Apple reported revenue of $124.3 billion, beating estimates by $273.49 million. They reported earnings per share of $2.40 per share, beating by 5 cents. For this quarter, Apple is expected to produce $94.06 billion in revenue and $1.61 earnings per share. Over the last 90 days, 5 analysts have raised estimates and 22 analysts lowered estimates. When we look at the price chart for Apple, we can see pretty familiar trend as we move through these tariff negotiations, where it's down and up, depending on what the tariff news of the day is. If we look at the PPO and the RSI, we can see the PPO is below the midpoint, but we do have a signal line crossover to the positive side, so that's good news. We do have RSI that's right at the midpoint, just barely above the midpoint at 51.96. So it looks like either neutral to positive momentum as we move into the earnings. And finally, we get to the Chevron Corporation, which is the last of the companies that I hold that's reporting. They report on Friday. In the previous quarter, they reported revenue of $52.23 billion, beating estimates by $3.82 billion. They reported EPS of $2.06 per share, missing estimates by a nickel. For this quarter, they're expected to produce $48.39 billion in revenue with $2.15 per share earnings. Over the last 90 days, 4 analysts have raised estimates and 10 analysts have lowered estimates. The Chevron price chart is showing some pretty rough price action here. We had a big drop in the price over a couple of weeks, worried about demand and any kind of recession we might have. We have seen a slight improvement in the price action. When we look at the PPO and the RSI, we can see that we are operating below the midline on the PPO. Looks like we're going to get a crossover the signal line, and the RSI has improved slightly to 40.98, but still operating below the midpoint. So it looks like it could be showing negative to neutral momentum going into earnings. So that wraps up an overview of the companies that I have in my portfolio that are reporting this week. I hope you found this beneficial. Please let me know if you have any of these holdings in your portfolio and what you're expecting as we move through the week. Hope you have a great day and a great trading week. We'll talk to you all later. Thank you.